Okay, welcome everyone. That was the new video, but it was without the sound. So if you really want to know our newest video, you will have to come to the next episode next Wednesday with sound. Luckily, we still have sound. So I'm really happy here to still be with Lucilla as co-host of this FSR Insight series, where we always invite academics. First of all, to give a presentation. And in this case, Michael Pollitt, professor at Cambridge, Judge Business School, will give a presentation on his latest paper, which I found very interesting. He published it over the summer. Basically, I always said academics are pro-nodal, but he's putting some doubts on that in our academic community. So he actually said in the paper that maybe the evidence is surprisingly weak. So then to select two discussants, we quickly looked at Tim, because Tim, not that long ago, published a paper saying that, yeah, there is many stakeholders having all kind of arguments against nodal, but here are my counter arguments against those stakeholder arguments. So he was actually taking the other side, which promises to be an interesting discussion. But nodal is often talked about at transmission level. And even if we do nodal at transmission, there is still a distribution grid behind. So you could argue that it will anyway be zonal unless you go all the way into distribution grids. And that's why we invited Ellen. Ellen is an expert on distribution grids. She's about to finish her PhD. And she will be joining us in Florence after she finishes at Vlerick Business School and KU Leuven. Of course, I should also say that Tim is in between MIT and now also going to London, but he's also still part of FSR as a professor here. And both of them, Ellen and Tim, will be the course co-directors of the course that is starting in just a few days from now on electricity markets. Okay, that was it. I should also say that this time, as you notice, I'm kicking off and I will do the moderation. So that means that Lucilla is keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A. Do not hesitate, because we have two discussants that can probably fill the hour, but we also want to hear from you. So we will try to pick up the questions that we think we can put to the panel. Okay, Michael, you will kick it off with a presentation, and then Ellen and Tim will take turns making comments. Go ahead.
Okay. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, Leo. Great to be invited to talk about this. And Leo, it's interesting that your introduction, because the reason why I wrote this paper was because a very dear colleague of mine stood up and said, nodal pricing is a no-brainer in Europe. And I thought, I wonder, is it? So I wrote this paper because clearly, if it was a no-brainer, as a good economist, one would say, hang on, if there are no-brainers around, we should have done them. But we've had energy markets for over 30 years across Europe. The single electricity market has been developing, and we haven't gone for nodal pricing. So, it clearly can't be a no-brainer. So anyway, that's the background to why I wrote this paper. So let's see how we get on. I should thank David Newbury who made that comment. I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying that, because actually did inspire me to write this paper. I should also thank Ofgem, who also pulled me into the debate that we've been having in Great Britain about whether we should introduce nodal pricing. And I should also thank FTI, who've done a huge amount of work doing modeling of nodal pricing effects in Great Britain, and who have also responded very generously to some of my comments on their work. As Leo said, actually what I'm going to do is stick to stuff that's largely in the paper that I published in July on our website, but I'll say a few more things as well. So the menu is quite full, so I'll try and keep going briskly through it to try and get to some of what I think are the core arguments, and also to make the point that Leo made, which is actually, for something that is the accepted orthodoxy in North America, there is surprisingly little evidence on the welfare effects of nodal pricing. Yeah, there's loads of stuff on the engineering, there's loads of stuff on how it works, and there's lots of reports on it, but it actually is very little academic analysis of nodal pricing. from a welfare point of view. And that is surprising for something that is claimed to have such positive no-brainer effects. So, clearly nodal pricing is something that works technically, and it does provide short-run signals for the better use of the transmission system and to reflect system constraints. I should say it was invented by power engineers, so it would be a bit weird if it was really good from a business model point of view, given that we don't use nodal pricing in most other networks for the reason that, consumers don't like nodal pricing. They expect people who run networks not to reflect all of the congestion constraints onto users. They expect them to manage them internally. That's how most networks work. Most economists have largely ignored the analysis of nodal pricing, but there is at least one very honorable exception in Frank Wolak, who has written 2 excellent papers on nodal pricing, which I will refer to. The first thing that one should never say about nodal pricing is that it's about location of transmission and generation assets. It's important to say that most practitioners would acknowledge that nodal pricing is about making use of the existing transmission system more efficiently. It's not about providing signals for long-term investment in transmission. That is a different thing, and there is no evidence that is very strong. Again, if somebody wants to provide some, that would be interesting, that actual transmission investments reflect nodal prices rather than the joint optimization of generation and transmission costs in the long run. So we should be very careful about citing arguments for nodal prices versus some of these short-run management of transmission constraints. Now, I'm not, I assume anybody who phones into a talk on nodal pricing knows something about nodal pricing, but in essence, nodal pricing is about reflecting transmission constraints, in particular reflecting loop flows in AC power systems, and also making sure that different locations reflect transmission constraints, and that gives rise to different prices at different nodes on the system. And in the standard example of nodal pricing, the generators receive lower prices if they're faced with transmission constraints, and the consumer pays a higher price because they are creating transmission constraints by demanding at a location where generation is constrained to reach. Okay, so now one of the issues with nodal pricing is nodal pricing basically reduces export constrained generators payments, increases import constrained loads payments, results in loads paying more in general than generators get, and the collection of congestion rents. It's important to emphasize that in the simple model of nodal pricing, prices are on average likely to be lower if these congestion rents are recycled back to consumers, and the actual power flows are the same. So the system that we have in Europe, where we clear the, if you like, the national price or the zonal price, create transmission constraints, and then have to pay people to be redispatched, that will result in higher payments, but it doesn't necessarily result in different power flows. And that's an important distinction between what happens in Europe and what happens in nodal prices. Now, okay, so this is where the, what are we really talking about gets interesting. My PhD involved doing some linear programming. One of the things I learned about linear programs is they're really, really sensitive to calculation. And what you assume about what the margin is matters. So, a node can be constrained or unconstrained But it depends what increment you're thinking about. So nodal prices usually are defined by, what would be the nodal prices arising if I assume 0.1 or 1 more megawatt of injection or withdrawal into the system. But of course, in general, we're not talking about those sorts of injections or withdrawals. We might be talking about, adding a data center, which is 100 megawatts. That's not really a nodal calculation. And similarly, it might make a difference if I only slightly increase the injection or withdrawal at a particular node. That might not show up a constraint, whereas if I put the data center on it, suddenly we have got a constraint. So nodal prices are likely to be sensitive to the increment problem. And that's, that's a standard mathematical problem, which isn't discussed, as far as I know, in the welfare literature on nodal pricing. The other thing to say about nodal pricing is it is generally based on an idea that, it's a first best solution to provide this locational price information, and necessarily everything is improved by having more price signals. Now, of course, economists are very skeptical about that. In a second best world where not everything is priced, suddenly introducing more prices isn't necessarily improvement, and it may exacerbate problems. For instance, if nodal pricing tells you, oh, we should locate everything near London in the UK. Well, you know what? There are other environmental constraints near London. There are other considerations to be taken into account, and those aren't being priced properly, and you may be exacerbating some of the overall welfare effects by suddenly introducing more price signals. The other thing that isn't well discussed in the literature on nodal pricing is what exactly is going on with market power. In the simple nodal example, actually, each of those two generators connected to the generation export constrained nodes were monopolists at their node, and splitting a market up, which is what effectively nodal pricing does, having smaller numbers of bidders resolving prices at individual nodes, that will increase market power unless you mitigate it. And of course, what happens in a nodal pricing system is there is tight regulation of nodal pricing bids. But let's be clear about that. That introduces an element of actual regulation in nodal prices. So, clearly we could more tightly regulate people's bids in balancing markets if we wanted to get a similar market power regulation effect to the effect that we see under nodal pricing. And even in the US, as you'll see from the PJM State of the Market report, there's a recognition that, yes, these market power mitigation measures are in place in nodal markets in the US, but even then, you've still got local market power problems. It's always amusing to me that, you end up having an argument with engineers about how market power work. Clearly, there is market power unless you mitigate it if you split markets. 1,000 years of economics tells you that's the case. What about the fact that you do introduce not only more local prices, but of course these local prices can be very volatile because the linear program, of course, flips between telling you that there's no constraint and there's large constraints, and the nodal prices may vary more than an averaged out national price. Well, people say, okay, let's have financial transmission rights, which will provide hedges against fluctuations in congestion rents. Yeah, that's what happens in the US. And actually, these financial hedges which are offered are very inefficient. So PJM State of the Market report says there is a problem with financial transmission rights. The realized value of financial transmission right in the US is only about 2/3 of the actual congestion generated. So 1/3 of the entire congestion revenue is captured by someone other than the consumers. Now, how you conceptualize that is interesting. Some of it is undoubtedly due to traders' actual costs, and some of it is what we might take to be a compensation for risk, where you have to buy off generators with some allocation of congestion rights. Yeah, and the argument is raging in the UK as to whether, what's the evidence on whether having these highly differentiated prices by location actually does raise investment risks for underlying investment. All of the people that I've spoken to who do investments say it does. People who've got investments in Texas say nodal pricing raises our investment costs. Okay. Now, the literature in general doesn't discuss whether it raises investment costs and what the impact of this is, but clearly it is a major potential cost if it does raise investment costs. Some companies claim the rise in congestion in investment costs is something like 2% on the cost of capital. Now, undoubtedly there may be exaggeration there, but it would seem to be unlikely that it was zero. Okay. So is nodal pricing really radically different from the alternatives? I mean, I think one can always think about locational signals from two directions. One can think that, okay, let's start from nodal pricing, price everything, price it every 5 minutes at all nodes. Or we can start from the other end, which is, as we are in Europe, from a lot of average prices, zonal pricing, and introduce more price signals on interconnectors, price signals on heavily congested lines, or have local constraint management markets. So one can come at the locational signal problem from two directions, and again, there's no real research on what the difference in coming at those two locational signal problems from different directions actually is, but clearly they could meet in almost the middle, subject to some research. So one can, one of the things that I argue in my paper is there's undoubtedly information in nodal prices. The question is, what is it? And who should be exposed to it? And that brings me back to the business model question. Just because we can calculate nodal prices doesn't really answer the question of who should be exposed to them. And even in the US, most loads are not exposed to nodal price. They pay zonal averaged prices. And it's not clear that it's a good idea to expose lots of generators to them either, given it might raise costs of capital. But there's clearly information there, and how we use it is an important question. So important to say that nodal pricing isn't just about the nodal price. It's about this system of price regulation plus the financial transmission rights. Understanding how those three things interact with each other is important. The modeling that's been done for the UK or for Great Britain shows there's large redistributive effects of introducing nodal pricing. Generators get paid a lot less. Consumers, in theory, get big transfers if they capture the congestion revenue as well. But which, of course, immediately indicates that one might want to worry about whether the net benefit is big enough to justify the fact you're going to have to deal with these big transfer payments, which have their own effects. Clearly, some nodes matter much more than others, such as interconnectors or transfers between zones. So the question of whether you want to divide the country up into 7 zones, 27 zones, or 850 nodes, what's the marginal value of increasing the resolution on a price signal? And the proven benefits are only in these short run savings. Some of the people that I've been discussing this with would cite papers which apparently show the benefit of location, but actually these papers show the benefit of average price differentials in the long run. So, having fluctuating prices in the short run isn't necessarily good for long run investment, and there isn't really any evidence to support that view. The reality, again, the fact is there is information out there which apparently hasn't been analysed by many people. There's state of the market reports from PJM, from all the other ISOs and RTOs, which people seem to ignore in terms of what they're saying, in terms of risk. They also, all these reports very clearly say the FTR market is inefficient and that consumers don't get all of the congestion revenue recycled to them. Nodal pricing, as Ellen perhaps will discuss, nodal pricing is just about pricing on the transmission system. There may be constraints below the transmission system within the distribution system, which are not being reflected up at the node price transmission node. And I mentioned some of Frank Wolak's work on Texas shows that, if you combine sharper locational signals with mispriced other environmental signals, you can actually end up with a worse situation, which is the case for his analysis of Texas, where his gains in terms of short-run dispatch savings are offset by higher carbon costs because you dispatch the coal plants more in his analysis. And I know Tim's going to comment on this. The fact is, redispatch costs are not zero under nodal pricing. Again, this is along the lines of the no-brainer comment. One only needs to think about it and think, well, hang on a minute. Given that we only resolve nodal prices down to 5 minutes, what happens within those last 5 minutes? The system operator may still need to redispatch, and hence when nodal modeling redefines defines this redispatch costs to be zero under nodal pricing, well, in reality, they're not zero. They can't be zero. The system operator must still be taking intervening actions which need to be compensated for. And that indeed appears to be the case if you read the State of the Market report. So just to wrap up, there is information in nodal pricing. The nodal modeling does, for Great Britain, certainly suggest that, there would be big benefits to consumers if you could reform constraint management and control bids in the constraint management market. Maybe some of the bids are excessive at the moment. If you could dispatch government contracted generation, which is under a contract for difference, in a more system optimal way, that would also yield big benefits and seems an obvious thing to do. And some reform of zones and having more zones would certainly help reduce constraint costs, without some of the risk, higher risk elements that might come with nodal pricing. So, moving to 4 zones in Germany rather than 1 might yield big benefits. And here is where I sort of move, well, this is what, as academics, we ought to be interested in, what selective use can be made of nodal prices. It may be that people who argue for nodal pricing are right in that the only way to get some of the benefits, which I think can be captured in other ways, which I mentioned on the previous slide, is nodal pricing, because maybe it's too complicated to do some other fix. But definitely more research is required. And for something that everybody thinks is a no-brainer, there's surprisingly little work done on the actual welfare effects of nodal pricing. And there's clearly more work could be done on it, especially given the huge amount of data that there is on nodal prices out there. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks. Great.
Thanks, Michael. I thought I already knew the literature on this topic, but you clearly went a level deeper. Really great. Okay, who wants to kick it off? I'm looking at Ellen and Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. It's good to see for the second time in less than 7 days discussing this topic. So I was already a bit prepared. So I'm gonna go through some points. Like there is indeed not that much literature that does a full-fledged welfare analysis of what has been the transition of nodal to zonal. There have been a couple of papers, and what they show is definitely that there is a lot of short-term operational efficiency benefits, and those are not minor. Those are a couple of percent, but a couple of percent of a lot of money is still a lot of money. What there is a lot of empirical evidence of is the downfall of zonal systems in the US. In the end of the 90s, there was the PGM and then ISO New England, and in the end of the 2000s, there was ERCOT and CAISO. And if you read those stories, which you can still find, mostly captured by Bill Hogan from Harvard, is that those systems really run into their end, because this kind of fallacy that grid constraints are not important in the day-ahead market, but in real time, they still have to be respected, somehow run into its limits. And that's also, I mean, one of the reasons that is sometimes told is that US grids were a lot less developed than European grids. European grids, especially within member states, have been highly developed. It's not the case within the US, especially not if you have ISOs who cover multiple states. So they sooner run into the limits of the zonal system. And then you see the costs and the gaming and all the court cases that quickly led to a nodal system. And if you would ask any US academic, at least the ones that I know, the ones in my department, there's none of them who has any doubt that that was a bad decision. They always say the same thing. We don't even ask that question. Nobody complains. We would never go back. And this is just so much better than what we're used to, where we basically run into almost a system failure before. So it is a non-brainer in that context. So about your specific points, the market power argument is the one that I really disagree with the most by far, because I think market power is really a function of the market structure, the amount of players, where they are located, and so on. It's not a function of whether you have any zonal or nodal pricing. It just appears in different pockets. I mean, in nodal systems, they appear in the day-ahead market quite transparently, because you can know which pockets are actually concentrated. In the zonal system, they appear near real time in redispatch markets, because you cannot fool the physics. And these players, they know it, that in the real time, supply has to match demand and the Kirchhoff laws has to be respected. So they can play with that. That's exactly what happened in the US system, and which is happening currently in Europe, in European systems. There's also evidence of that. So market power is always there. It's just like, depending on whether you have zonal or nodal, it appears in different pockets. And I would say that in a nodal system, it's a lot more transparent and maybe easier to monitor than in any zonal system. So that argument I really disagree with. About the dispatch, I mean, the dispatch, in theory, it's the same if you assume non-convexity, if you assume away non-convexities, if you assume away market power. But in reality, it's not the same. That's why these studies find 2 or 3% of gains in operational benefits. And it has to do with the idea that in nodal systems, at least in day ahead, your schedule is close to what it will be in real time. And there is an element of time. If you have to redispatch really close to real time, a couple of hours ahead, you don't have the same generation set available than you would have the day before. So that kind of speed element makes it a lot harder to have like the most efficient dispatch in a zonal system, because you have to reshuffle so much more, and you cannot reshuffle with everybody if you come close to real time. About the financial transmission rights, I mean, this is a very known story in the US. If you read the market monitoring reports from PGM back to 2010, the market monitor, Joseph Boring, will say the same thing over and over again. The market design for FTRs is flawed. The market design for FTRs is flawed. And what he also writes is that we can improve it. We know how to improve it. But somehow we don't manage to push that through. There have been requests at FERC to make that changes. So all these problems, they're very well known. I don't think they are a feature of nodal pricing or a feature of FTR. They are a feature of how FTRs are currently implemented, but this is not necessarily the only way that you can implement FTRs. And about the idea that nodal pricing increases risk, it doesn't really increase risk. What it does is it transfers locational risk from being socialized to the ones who can actually do something about it, being the generators of the load, can they do it in a perfect way? The perfect hedge does not exist. FTRs are imperfect, but the question is, does it cost more to socialize this rather than allocate it to the ones who might be able to do something about it? And then about the redispatching in nodal, yes, there is some redispatching, but these transmission constraint penalty factors, they are something that uplift the price. They are not costs. And this is very similar, like maybe what is more common is the ORCD curve that uplifts the price the moment you have little reserves. Well, this uplifts the price the moment you have near network violations in certain pockets. So the amount of cost of redispatch is an order of magnitude less than the uplift cost of these transmission constraint penalty factors who purely want to send a signal. And it was the first time that I ever read about them because I saw them in your slides, and it really took me half a day to understand what they are. And it requires a lot more research to really understand what they are, because maybe I think that I understand it, but maybe not completely. So then my speculation is, I think nodal pricing is not perfect, but overall, it still would be a very much of a net benefit. But why doesn't it happen? So there's one big hurdle, which you already said. There's a huge transfer from producer surplus to consumer surplus. There's a lot of people who wouldn't like that. And there's two barriers. One is that if you have nodal pricing, especially in the EU, you really need a European market. Nodal pricing means the borders, bidding zone borders, which are country borders, they will fade away. It also means that you have to give away system operation way more closer to real time, because you have a real-time market, which market clearing and grids are cleared together, which means that national TSOs have to give away some of their system operation function to a European-wide market operation function, which is something that nobody's waiting for at national level. And then the second is that nodal pricing is more than just making more prices in more nodes. It's a market design package, like you say. You need FTRs. You need to change the bidding formats, probably. You need to change the pricing rules. You need to change, you don't have portfolio bidding anymore. This is a lot of stuff. I mean, ERCOT has 10,000 nodes. They clear every 5 minutes. In Europe, we have 40-something bidding zones, and we almost don't manage to clear for one each hour. So it's nothing to do with zonal or nodal, it's everything to do with these other elements. And this is something that a lot of stakeholders are very much against. So should we go to more zones? Yeah, definitely, because it seems nodal is not going to happen in the next 5 years. What is the problem with more zones? Okay, where do you stop? It also creates a lot of risk, because in 2 years, it's in Germany 4 zones. The 3 years after, they have 8 zones. I mean, this is not something investors are waiting for us, neither. So having nodal at least creates some sort of like the end game. And the other thing is that you still not co-optimize transmission with trade under zonal pricing. You do have to make some anticipation on what you assume the trade will be when you allocate some capacity between the zones to the market clearing algorithm, which is something you don't really have to do in nodal pricing. And that creates a lot of loss of available transmission capacity. And I think the first place where we'll see nodal pricing, I mean, I hope in Great Britain, but I don't think so, but I think it will be offshore. Because there's no way, and there's no way you can do zonal. I mean, every line there is by definition structurally congested. So if you would read the European regulation, that would mean what they call offshore bidding zones, but what I think are nodal prices. But maybe offshore bidding zones sounds better. So that would be my comments.
That was a very interesting number of messages within one comment, Tim. So, Michael, I don't know if you will go one by one, but I guess a reaction on some points is due.
Yeah, I mean, well, let me take them. Let me just bat all of them away. Okay, first of all, zonal pricing hasn't collapsed in Europe, so I don't know what happened in the US. We've had zonal pricing for years and it seems to be okay. Market power, okay, come on. The fact is that there's very intransparent monitoring going on in US nodal markets, which are quite difficult to understand what's going on. One can easily see market power in redispatch markets very easily. So, I think this market power argument in nodal pricing is really important, and it is the people I've spoken to about it are clear. Actually, nodal pricing is an extension of the regulated market that used to exist prior prior to deregulation in the US. I love the way you just said, oh, it's a known problem about FTRs. Yeah, it's a known problem. Nothing's been done about it. And people should stop saying, oh, we just need FTRs if we're implementing nodal pricing. Hang on a minute. They don't know how to do them in the US. So why don't we need to stop and at the very least redesign the whole concept of FTRs. Okay. I loved you saying it's just about risk transfer. Tell that to an investor. You know, that's also a bit of a joke to say that. You know, the fact is that the allocation of risk with respect to investments is at the center of the energy transition, trying to mitigate risks in order to get people to invest in capital intensive technologies at low cost is a central problem in Europe. So you can't just say it's about risk mitigation and it's just about throwing risk onto parties who will have to pay and incur costs to mitigate that risk. Yeah, and you know, my point remains. I completely agree with you about you know, the redispatch costs are lower under nodal pricing, but there are still some, and the modeling redefines them away to be zero. So, you know, any modeling has to include the fact that there are still some redispatch costs, because in the real world, we're incurring those costs at the moment. And to argue that they're going to disappear to zero under nodal pricing is not factually correct. So, thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Michael. I also made some notes just to make sure we come back to some other points, but let me first let Ellen intervene, and then maybe we go also to Lucilla, because there are really a lot of questions in the Q&A box.
Yes, maybe one thing I want to tap into when looking is on the market power, because I think you both have arguments. It will happen both in nodal markets, it will happen both in congestion management markets. Where you can mitigate it best, we'll have to see. But something that isn't mentioned currently in the discussion is also the index gaming that we are seeing at the distribution level. And we did also some research on it, that it might not be that easily to detect and mitigate as well. So that's maybe also a point not to forget, with market power, kind of gaming also coming. With the current system that we have. Then maybe my other ones were more comments are more questions from discussions we have at distribution level, and I see coming back here again. The first thing is, for example, about giving the right signals in the long term also for investments. That's something that you say that will be important, and I was wondering if we go more to this nodal pricing, what will then be also the importance of incentive regulation and giving incentives for system operators to also make the appropriate investment. And maybe we can learn from this discussion now here also for what the discussion that we are seeing at the distribution level, because it is still unclear in these distribution network plans that are now becoming more and more important. It's still an open question. Okay, how will we give these right incentives? So maybe there are some common lessons learned we can make there. And then finally, I think also I like the point you make about the degree of resolution of nodal pricing, what will be optimal, and also the terminology, right? Because nodal pricing, it can still mean a lot of things. I think currently the discussion is more at transmission level, but with all this congestion we are seeing, for example, in countries like the Netherlands and Germany, this discussion at distribution level might also become more and more prominent. So here I'm curious also to see what type of research we'll be needing to facilitate this discussion also more at distribution level.
Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, Michael has also been doing quite some work on flexibility markets at distribution level, so I'm sure he also wants to react to that. Michael?
Yeah, well, thanks, Ellen. I mean, I think, you know, the ink debt problem, I think this, you know, this exists, and it's just, the fact is, if you reduce the number of bidders on an individual node, you have to price regulate them more carefully. And of course, I think that is what is going on in nodal pricing. And so these local market power problems are exacerbated by nodal pricing unless you counteract them. I think at the distribution level, I've got the scars on my back from trying to price congestion at the distribution level. I agree this is a big issue. And I think the issue there is, one of the things I took away from that was a lot of it is about the allocation of property rights. Why are we assuming that anybody can just connect to the network regardless of what the cost they impose on the network? We have to reduce people's connection rights and actually get people to prove that they are creating value for the entire network through connection. I think thinking this is all about decentralizing things through price signals, I think is a mistake. And I think we need to move much more to sort of rights-based management with some use of price signals. And because one of the reasons why you can't extend nodal pricing down to the distribution level is not only because there's lots of local market power and that increases, but because people don't respond to price signals at the distribution level, and so price ceases to be helpful, and one needs to think of other ways to induce response.
Thank you, Michael. Ellen, you want to react to? Yeah.
Yes, because you mentioned something I was also wondering, because you talk about this, about giving non-firm connection capacities. And this is something we see at distribution level already happening, right? In zones where there's a lot of congestion, it's happening to connect new grid users. But then I was wondering, if you have these non-firm connection agreements, can't nodal pricing then also not bring opportunities, because in the short term you allocate the network more efficiently, so maybe the non-firm part can become smaller for those new grid users. That's something that was playing inside my mind.
Yeah, so how to combine both concepts, basically.
Yes.
Yes, and that's, I spent about 7 years thinking about that problem, and it's very, very difficult. But yes, the answer is some combination of sending some signals and increased control, because you can't use prices alone to manage the system.
Thank you, Michael. I think now is the good time to also bring in some questions from the audience. So Lucilla, go ahead.
Thank you, Lau. Indeed, we had throughout the presentation and the discussions, I think we had a lot of comments, a lot of questions between this debate between zonal price and nodal price. Indeed, I collected some of them. I think the first one and the last one is quite interesting, because it requests about to what extent the subsidiations, to what extent nodal price would it be, having nodal price would be difficult for renewables generations with non-subsidized ruling out. So William bring a question, and he gave an example of, for instance, of New Zealand. So this should not only be technical TSO to discuss, but broader policy, renewables, energy policy, and objectives. Nodal solves one issue, but may cause many others. So perhaps one thing to ask Michael, if you could have given some examples beside US. In this case, William is bringing New Zealand. There are two other questions that I think it's worth to discuss. One is on capacity mechanisms. So Federica bring here an issue of the new countries' capacity mechanisms are in discussion. Let's assume that they will materialize in most countries. How would you organize the spot market? Does it make sense to tailor the spot to short-term efficiency only by introducing nodal? And perhaps a third question that is not related to subsidiation or capacity mechanism, but in terms of congestion. And Daniel is bringing a case for eSpan. So nodal price seems to be related with congestion issues, but in highly decarbonized power systems like SPAN, we see that most of the expansion actions are not taken to deal with congestion issues, but not solve other location of operation constraints, for instance, inertia or voltage programs. So to what extent would nodal price be useful for this location operation and constraints? So perhaps these three questions is good enough to hit up the questions and answers bring from the audience, and perhaps not only to Michael, but when Tim and Alan would like to intervene, just raise your hand. There is enough with late.
Thanks, Lucia. Okay, yeah, New Zealand, love to know more about that. Yeah, they've had nodal pricing for years and nobody's written about it. So one assumes it's had no effect, or we would have heard a bit more about it. I've worked on New Zealand and nobody's really mentioned nodal pricing to me. I think one of the things I do say in my paper is, is nodal pricing about efficiency, or is it about distributional effects? Because I think in some countries people think it's fair to have people paid according to their location, and actually I think that's as I get older as an economist, one wants to flip up conventional logic and think actually maybe having time space varying prices isn't about efficiency, it's about what people think is fair. And then maybe in New Zealand they think it's fair to do that rather than to have average prices and for people not to bear the costs of their location. I think on the spot market question, I think this again is a really interesting point, because it seems to me there's a lot of confusion out there. I mean, in the US, they seem to have all of the conventional markets that we have plus nodal pricing. Okay, so it's not that they don't have over-the-counter markets. It's not that they don't have longer run hedging markets. They just have nodal pricing as well. I mean, and I think there's a sort of implication that there's strictly more prices and there's strictly more contracts. There's not less. Okay, and I think again this is something poorly understood, poorly researched on. I like the point about congestion only. Again, there's a lot of hand waving going on. Of course, in the US, they still have what they call ancillary markets, which don't include congestion management. One of the interesting things about redispatch is that people are often pulling price bids. And so what happens in the UK is you pull a price bid out of the balancing market and use that for redispatch. Okay, so in a sense, one can think of one can think of in the limit, everybody has to put in prices for everything into their bidding algorithm, and the system operator should choose what to do with these bids. Whether it's to use people for frequency response, for reserves, or for reactive power, or for constraint management. And of course, we want those prices to be not subject to gaming. But yeah, I think it's a really good question about this sort of how co-optimization works and how we can improve co-optimization across every ancillary service, including congestion management.
Tim, Alan, do you like to comment about the questions? Go ahead, Tim.
Yes, I would like to comment on the question of New Zealand and this idea that if you have nodal, then it becomes a lot more risky to build renewables, because they will all build at the same spot and then prices go down, and this is a huge risk. So it's obvious that if you introduce nodal pricing, that these renewable heavy pockets will see lower prices, which, I mean, this is not you don't have to hide that truth. This is very well known. And that means that if you have CFDs in place or other government instruments, that you will have to pay more via those instruments to make up for the strike price. Okay. But at the same time, what it's doing now, the support is just given implicitly by acting as if the network constraint does not exist. That is what the zonal price does. So the subsidy is in being a zone and not recognizing the node. So you have to ask the question, what is the most efficient way of giving that subsidy? Very transparently, explicitly via higher payments via CFDs, or very inefficiently via a redispatch mechanisms and all kind of stuff that impacts the rest of the dispatch of the system in a zonal system. So that is, for me, that kind of trade-off. You have to pay them anyhow. It's just different of zonal nodal. You have to pay them in different ways with different kind of effects. And actually in a zonal system, you'll often pay them quite a lot for not even producing, because they'll massively have to be curtailed, which might not be the case in a zonal system. And then I really like the comments of, I think it's Jean-Marie from RTE, who says, why are you still discussing about these different arguments? You have to look at the real world. Well, I think that was kind of the purpose of the paper I wrote, to say many of these arguments I don't agree with, There are some real issues, and these real issues, unfortunately, they were so political that they didn't make it to the paper. But one of those that you say is that obviously if you go nodal, you really have to make system operation more European, and that's not going to happen. And I'm okay with that, but please just say it. It's not about the thing that doesn't work or inefficient. It's about there's some political hurdles that just make it impossible. Fine, then I take my rest and I go to my room and I'm okay. But not these other, I mean, some of the arguments that Michael says, of course, there's trade-offs, right? But for me, there's no really strong killer argument, which is often in the European stakeholder debates. And you also mentioned the topology changes. I mean, you can do topology changes in nodal systems as long as optimization improves. There are papers who say that if you already use the system better by having nodal instead of zonal, the value of topology changes becomes a lot less. Yes, the value is high in zonal system because you really don't use the network well. So this is another kind of argument. And I know that the French are very keen of topology changes. This would be my response, but I do appreciate the input.
Ellen?
Yes, for maybe just for me to add, I think it will also be interesting to see how this discussion of offshore breeding zones will evolve. I think there is where we will see the first implementation of these more smaller zones, maybe like Tim said, even quicker than the zone bidding reforms we are seeing. So maybe we can learn some from this discussion as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think it's clear that when starting the debate, you know, I was expecting a debate between engineers and economists, but actually in engineers, nodal, it's possible, it's viable. And here we are having indeed a discussion about distribution effects of having this new system model, but it still have like the politics side, the political discussion. I think Bren asked a question exactly related on this. Like going nodal may present more rational, therefore less political way forward. I think it's more than actually a question. It's an answer. It's a rhetorical question, Bren. But Lau, I would give you back to you the floor.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Maybe just to pick up then on this offshore element. So are you sure we will go nodal offshore? Because we're also talking about offshore energy hubs. Is that not the new kind of zones? So I don't know, isn't it possible that we will have, you know, another scenario that is not entirely zones? I even see already islands with electrolyzers, and you know, then you start to have a zone rather than a node.
Should I answer? For me, a node is a place where more than 3 lines meet, right? So, or at least 3 lines meet. This hub could be a node. It's just a big node. But I think the cables between those hubs will be quite structurally congested, because it's very costly to overbuild them, and if there's not wind flowing, then it will be trade flowing. So therefore, okay, if one hub is one, and the hubs will actually help, because if you have some load offshore, which would happen if you have some hydrogen that some other people talk about offshore, that will actually push the prices back up in these nodes, and that might make that impact on increased CFD payments less bad. And I know it's not a good time to talk about CFD payments for offshore, especially if they need to be larger, but that would be the dynamics.
Okay, then I'll take the opportunity to ask another question. Last week, I was invited to comment on Acer's report on the 70% rule, right? The level of implementation, and whether we should keep that kind of ex-ante regulation of available capacity. So in this view, right, if we go either to nodal or better zones, do we still need some regulation like that? Or how do you see that?
Well, I can comment on that very frankly, as I think the 70%, I mean, any engineer would tell you that it doesn't make any sense, but it's a political instrument, right? To make redispatch higher and to show that in the end, it makes a lot of sense to split up your bidding zones. So it's an instrument rather than a political or political economy instrument, rather than an efficient market tool to, in the longer run, obtain what you want, which is more zones, rather than in the shorter run, really find the optimal trade-off between redispatch and cross-border trade, because we know that this changes every hour on every border, and the 70% rule is completely, I would say, blind for that. But in the longer run, it can push certain changes in the regime that might be very beneficial. And I don't think that that's a bad idea. It's just a lot of pain on the short run, I guess, for many TSOs.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not arguing about the fact that there should be more zones or there should be more locational signals. I mean, I think what I'm pointing out is, we need to do a cost benefit analysis on how many nodes you have, and when you're talking about the offshore, I mean, the whole thing is a bit of a funny idea, isn't it? Because the nodal price is being determined on the basis of a small increment, but actually what we're talking about are huge increments. And we're talking about big nodes, Tim used the term big nodes. At what point does does a zone become a big node? So, I think we need to be much more, precise about what it is we're talking about and what we're really doing, because most of those 10,000 nodes in PJM aren't doing anything. So what you need to explain, they're not doing anything in welfare terms. And I think that's, the important thing. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on is, in the UK, we still have zonal transmission charges. So nobody's saying that you shouldn't have location-based transmission charges. But that's not quite the same as nodal pricing, because nodal pricing is about reflecting congestion constraints. So, yes, of course, if you're bringing power from further away and the marginal system cost is higher, you should pay more. But of course, that often doesn't happen at the moment across Europe when it should. So thinking about reform of transmission charging is an important part of improving the efficiency of the existing system.
But I would add that they're not substitutes. Improved locational transmission charges and more locational short-term signals. They are equally complements. I don't know out of the back of my head whether they have very location-specific transmission charges in the US. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. And they do send let's say, a certain signal for maybe some siting decisions, which might not be that obvious with short-term locational signals. But I also think, I agree. I also read the literature. I did my homework. The evidence on siting decisions based on locational prices is extremely limited. There was the case study from ERCOT. But I also think and this is again looking at probably something like 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, if you look ahead, there's more and more kind of generation, especially load, that might have some sort of discretion in where to locate itself. So I would not only look at the past for what these locational siting decisions can be influenced when the future might be quite a bit different. But again, electrolyzers, I'm not a super pro hydrogen person, but it's just an easy example. And EV charging stations, or maybe let's say more modular power generators, not the big coal plants that needs to be next to the coal mine or the river. There might be some more options to put your assets in other places.
Yeah, but of course, this is where we're talking about different things now. We're talking about marginal incentives versus average incentives. The fact is that most of this is about average incentives. It's not about marginal incentives. And we should be very, we're talking about big increments of capacity. We're talking about moving big things around. Of course, once you start moving big things around, well, then you have to reconfigure the transmission system anyway. So, I think, the idea that these benefits are going to be even bigger in the future actually itself is quite a questionable one, because it's not clear what the margins are doing. So I'd be very careful about that sort of assumption.
It's hard to do empirical work about the future. So.
Yeah, but I think this is where one could do empirical work about the past as to what is this about moving a 10 megawatt wind farm or battery around, or is it about big increments? And I think nobody has even begun to work on that.
And I think that's the moment to close. We're out of time. I knew this was going to fly by like nothing, and it did. It was a very animated discussion. It was a very open discussion. I really appreciated it. Thank you. Thank you to Michael. Thank you to Tim. Thank you to Ellen. Thank you also, Lucilla, for managing all these questions. Really, and it's not the last time that we will discuss this, but still I learned something new every discussion on this topic, which is nice. And as Tim said before we started, you can see that the crisis is over when we go back to discussing the classics like nodal pricing. So maybe that's something we can all agree on. And thanks again, all of you, for being here. We had a really high number of registrations, and hopefully see some of you next week also, because I'm pretty curious to know what that video looks like with audio. So see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.